Teshbuchto ikoro da itioto kadisto wamshabachto. This is the 64th Maronite podcast. Let us now consider Theodoret, who is our chief source for the life of St Maroun, and the critique of him and his testimony by Mati Musa. Mati Musa correctly observes that there is no reason to discredit Theodoret's account of St Maroun, which was, after all, based on the statements of Jacob, who had been a follower of Maroun. But Musa states that Theodoret affords Maroun no special place or excellence in the austere life. He goes on to say, as already pointed out, nothing in his work suggests that Maroun had achieved such a high degree of piety as to gain him the eminent position attributed to him by later Maronite writers. First, this is bewildering. I genuinely wonder how anyone could, in good faith, read the remarkable statements which Theodoret wrote about St Maroun and then say this. It is almost comic, as if I asserted the truth of a matter by the most solemn declarations, for example, that the sun is hot, and someone then asked, so you believe the sun to be cold. Next, it is hard to counter this assertion because there is no argument in it whatsoever. It is the merest assertion, and as such the appropriate answer would be a mere counter-assertion. But to simply contradict him seems arbitrary. One wants to point to an error, not merely an assumption. But in this case, the point is that there are both a questionable fundamental assumption and mere assertions. One is almost tripped up by the concentration of errors in this passage when one tries to deal with it. So let us take it slowly. Accepting Musa's assertions for the sake of argument, what is the internal logic? It seems to be 1. Nothing in Theodoret's work suggests that Maroun was very pious. 2. Therefore, he cannot have been eminent. Looking at this purely logically, something is missing here. It is the assumption, that in order to have been eminent, you must have been said to be very pious. And all you have to do is state that implicit assumption to see how weak his arguments are. Further, there is a sleight of hand here. Musa begins by saying that Theodoret did not say certain things about St Maroun, and therefore later Maronite writers cannot have meant other things about St Maroun. Whatever Theodoret may or may not have said, why can later Maronite writers not have thought something different? Why are they bound to what Theodoret said? They had also the tradition of veneration of St Maroun. They had the main monastery of Syria Secunda named after him. The monks were known as belonging to St Maroun. From them has come our modern devotion and beliefs about St Maroun. There is continuity over 1600 years. This alone would establish among them the conviction of St Maroun's holiness, just as many today know next to nothing about many saints, yet firmly believe in their holiness. Further, as we have already seen, Musa falsely claims that there were several ascetics named Maroun to whom St John Chrysostom could have written. But when we examine his reference, they all lived after our St Maroun. This suggests to me that our saint was so great a figure that other ascetics took his name. Then it seems once more to be a debating trick to refer back to what one says one has established without saying quite where. A reader is apt to assume that the author is truthful and is alluding to something which has indeed been proved. But here it has not. What has been asserted is that Theodoret affords Maroun no special place or excellence. But at this point, Musa has not quoted Theodoret at all. He gives his own potted summary, and even in that summary, he says, within a short time, he became known for his austerity, piety, and healing power, which later attracted people from all over Syria. Because of his reputed divine power, it was rumoured that even devils shunned his presence. When he died, his devotees fought for possession of his body. I would have thought that rather being the proof for what was already pointed out, his words, it is actually contradictory. Even Musa's summary proves that St Maroun was a major figure of piety in all of Syria and had a reputation as a living saint. Enquiry noted that Theodoret mentions 30 ascetics, but only Maroun is named as having had many pupils. There's even more. Look at what Musa left out of his summary of Theodoret on Maroun. From paragraph 1, that St Maroun adorned the godly troop of the holy ones. Maroun did not only employ the customary labours, but he conceived others also, gathering together the wealth of wisdom. So he was an innovator, as well as someone who preserved existing treasures. From paragraph 3, that Maroun cultivated many crops through his wisdom. It was he who planted the paradise which now blooms in the land of Kuros. So he was not only an ascetic living alone, he was also active, even if he did his work through others. And from paragraph 4, it is not Maroun's tomb which contents us, but his memory. So he was remembered, and with great reverence. These extracts show that St Maroun was considered the establisher of the faith, or at least the monastic tradition, in Kuros, and Musa has omitted these at the pertinent point. This and the other omissions go directly to the question of St Maroun's reputation, which is what Musa puts in question. The fact that Theodoret's chapter on St Maroun is so short may be explainable on a simple hypothesis which Musa never considers. That is, that Theodoret knew more about the others than he did about Maroun. After all, Theodoret did not personally know him, whereas he had personally met many of the others. In that case, the brevity of his chapter on St Maroun tells us more about Theodoret than it does about Maroun. Further rhetoric is found in Musa's argument that certain writers wrongly say that St Maroun was the head of the ascetics and monasteries of Kuros. First of all, to say that he was the head may only mean that he was the source. This is exactly what Theodoret had said about Maroun, but which Musa omits. Then, when one Maronite speaks of St Maroun being head of a distinct school, even if this is wrong, so what? What does that prove about St Maroun? But further, is that in fact wrong? It seems open on the terms of Theodoret's text, and this argument continues for over 2 pages in Musa's book. In a typical move, Musa then targets scholars whose work is barely, if ever, read today, and were not considered experts on Maronite history. Among the lines of attack on the historicity of St Maroun, it is Musa's denial of any link to St Symeon or Simon Stylites. This takes us a little way from the consideration of the life of St Maroun, but since it is relevant to Maronite history, and since Musa deals with it here, we will consider it now. It is agreed that there is no evidence that St Maroun, and St Symeon ever met. After all, they were both ascetics who stayed in one particular place. But this is not the same as saying that they had no communication, or even perhaps that at some point they did not meet, just that there's no evidence. We should recall that we are speaking of an area in history for which there are very few documents. The real issue is the connection between St Symeon and the Christians who became the Maronites. That's the real question. Musa states that any association between Symeon the Stylite and the Maronite nation, his term, is pure historical fantasy. But is he correct? St Symeon lived from about 380 to 445, which means that he must have been between 30 and 43 when St Maroun died. The association between the Stylite and the Maronite nation is unclear, but I am not sure why he speaks about a Maronite nation. The word nation is anachronistic. The question is the association between St Symeon and Maronites, or peoples of the area which later became the heart of the Maronite people, because that is what the historical record shows. This is apparent from the Syriac life of Symeon, first known from a document known as Syriac manuscript MS 160. That manuscript is dated to the year 473. As El-Khoury notes, the manuscript is held in Rome, where in 1719 Simon Assamani, a Maronite priest, translated it from Syriac into Latin. There are other examples of the text. These were collated and translated into English by Robert Doran. So, who was Simon Stylite? As Downey says, he was the first and most famous of the pillar saints who won veneration for his extreme self-mortification, which gave him such an enormous influence, not only in Antioch itself, the city which always claimed him as its own, but throughout the empire, and made him a familiar figure in later times. He was born in about 389 in the far north of Syria, near the border of Cilicia, modern-day Turkey, and there's evidence that he spoke and wrote Syriac, namely letters between himself and Cosmas, which were in Syriac. At some point between 410 or 412, just at the time when St Maroun either had just died or was in advanced old age and soon to die, he travelled to a place called Tel Nasrin, perhaps the Eagle's Ruin, which was only about 30 miles east of Antioch. Probably around the year 417, he changed his way of life to the one which made him so celebrated. He began to live on a pillar, which in Greek is stylos, and hence he came to be known as the Stylite, that is, the one on the pillar. Although Theodoret's life does not explicitly say so, it is thought that the pillar was intended both to allow him to live a harder life in penance for his sins and to lift him above the ground, making him less accessible. As more and more people flocked to him, he found it expedient to live on pillars which were ever higher. In 429, he ascended his highest and final pillar, one which stood about 60 feet high. He remained on that until his death. A major church was built for him at St Maroun, east of Antioch, which became an important destination for pilgrims, a feature which accords with the contents of Syriac manuscript MS 160. In English translation it reads, "After this, a great crowd came to the saint from Lebanon. They told him about evil animals who roamed over all the mountain of Lebanon, ravaging and attacking and devouring men. Wailing and mourning were raised throughout the whole region, for there was not one region in which 2 or 3 people were not being devoured every day at least. As they told it, sometimes the creatures looked like women with shorn hair, wandering and lamenting, sometimes like wild beasts. They would even enter into houses and seize people and snatch children from their nursing mother's arms and eat them right in front of their eyes. And the mothers could not lift a finger to help their little ones, so that there was mourning and lamentation. No one could go out into the open country alone, but only in groups armed with swords and clubs. Even then, the animals did not turn aside out of people's way except for a little distance. Then the animals would follow in their footsteps. When the saint heard these things from them, he said, God has repaid you according to your deeds. For you forsook the one who in his benevolence made you and provides for you and nourishes you in his mercy. And you fled for help to dumb, useless idols who can neither help nor harm you. Because of this, God has handed you over to wicked beasts who wreaked vengeance on you as your deeds deserve. Go now and call on these idols whom you worship. We will continue with this in the next podcast. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit. Amen.